Good morning. Never before have I read through the lectionary texts for a given Sunday and wanted to preach on all four. Sometimes I go for the Old Testament text, Genesis or Exodus, if I've got a choice. Sometimes a good parable will get me excited. Rarely do I go for a psalm, almost never an epistle. But this week, you guys, these texts are all so good. So we heard all four of them read this morning. And this will be a sermon in 4 acts, just like This American Life. We will hear these 4 texts. I will expand on them, looking through the lens of wisdom. All of these texts give us ways to know and understand wisdom. That's one way to understand wisdom, knowledge plus experience. So how do we know and experience God? In 4 acts, creation, the law, weakness, and holy anger. So that's where I'm headed this morning. Let's start with Act 1, Psalm 19 and creation. C.S. Lewis wrote, "I take this to be the greatest poem in the Psalter and one of the greatest lyrics in the world." Psalm 19 is divided into 3 different parts: the revelation of creation, the revelation of the law, and a prayer for cleansing and preservation from sin. Because of the differences in style and content in these different sections, many scholars believe that they were written by different authors at different times and then later got put together. But either way, the beauty of these passages is undeniable. Creation is described as God's primary way of communicating. God expresses himself through this marvelous creation using warmth and light and darkness and color and texture. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the earth. Sunrises, sunsets, the heavens, this is God's canvas. This is God's language of love without words. And I don't think that this has to be taught. I think this is something we know intuitively. This week, I got so many photographs for our nature slideshow of sunrises and clouds and sunsets. And I don't know that many of you would call yourself nature photographers, but there is something about a sunrise that calls to us. We were in Florida this past week, and one morning we got up early to head down to the beach to watch the sunrise, and people were spread out all along the beach. Were these people religious? Were they quoting Psalm 19? Probably not, just me and my mom, likely. But every day, people gathered at sunrise and at sunset to watch this beautiful thing, this melty gold puddle disappearing and appearing from the horizon. This very ordinary, predictable, and breathtaking thing. Last week we sang, "Fresh as the morning, sure as the sunrise, God always faithful." So there is something that happens when we look to the sky and receive. Receive with awe God's love and light and warmth, especially in northern Indiana. Even people who do not profess any particular beliefs know that it is worth paying attention to the sky. Act 2, the law. This is the continuation of Psalm 19, and then we're moving into the Exodus text. So the second part of the psalm introduces us to the second way that we know God, the law, and it's worth paying attention to the tender way that the law is described here. Perfect, reviving the soul, rejoicing the heart, clear, enlightening. This is not oppressive, like top-down, controlling law. This is law that is sweeter than honey, finer than gold. So maybe you're wondering, what is this law that's like so great? Is it the 10 Commandments? Because they're fine, but like sweeter than honey, finer than gold? So I want you to remember back to our Exodus Bible study last fall. Paul Kime reminded us that the Ten Commandments are given in the midst of what is a rough patch for the Israelites. Moses has been up on the mountain for 40 days, and the people are starting to worry. They cannot see God, and so they make a distorted image of God, something that they can see. That was a mistake, clearly. And so Paul argued that the law is not just a set of rules. It's a reminder in the midst of this disobedience of who God has promised to be, a liberator who freed them from slavery and a covenantal God. We heard about this from Mary last week. A God who initiates relationship, even after the people are disobedient and make a golden calf. So it's not just the law that is the source of wisdom. It's this relationship around the law, the promise of ongoing faithfulness, even when they are sinful, especially when they are sinful. So the sweetness of the law is not the sweetness of rules, per se, although for some of us rule followers, clear expectations and rules can be as sweet as honey. The rules themselves are good. They are a blueprint for what a faithful life looks like. But no, it's the promise of the relationship that accompanies these laws. Safwat Marzouk built on this argument the week after, and he drew on 9th century Midrashic writings in which, following this conversation with Moses, like God's anger is burning hot, but as God is calming down, these are the words that God speaks in this ancient Midrash. When I conquer, I lose. When I am conquered, I gain. I conquered the generation of the flood, but I did not gain, for I destroyed my world. So too with the generation of the Tower of Babel, so too with the men of Sodom. At the sin of the golden calf, I was conquered. Moses prevailed over me to forgive their sin, and I gained. I gained in that I did not destroy them. I remember Safwat saying that and getting goosebumps. I wrote it down. When I am conquered, I gain. Suddenly, the foolishness of the cross made sense to me in a new way. Suddenly, we jumped through the Bible, and I had no problem reconciling the God of Exodus with Christ on the cross. A God who is willing to limit themselves to be in relationship with creation, no matter the cost. Even when that promise is foolish, because it doesn't take a genius to know that God's people will screw up again and again, but God's promise remains. Which, if you were listening, that moves us to Act 3, wisdom and foolishness. For God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. God's weakness is stronger than human strength. God chooses what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose the things that are not to reduce to nothing the things that are. These words from 1 Corinthians sound quite a bit like, I was conquered and I gained. This is the God that keeps trying to communicate with us through creation, through covenants, through the law, through making God's self the size of a baby in a manger. A God willing to undergo the humiliation of death on a Roman cross. God keeps trying to be in relationship with us and be known by us and is willing to be conquered for us, to be a fool for us. Wisdom and foolishness, strength and weakness, these are the things that God turns on their heads in ways we can only understand in glimpses. Several months ago, I read A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle to my son Caleb. This is probably one of my favorite books of all time, and I was so excited to be able to read it to him. 3 kids go on an interplanetary quest through time and space to rescue their father. And one of the characters, Mrs. Witch, speaks entirely in quotes because it's easier for her to communicate that way. So throughout the book, she quotes from Shakespeare and Horace and Cervantes. And when Meg, one of the main characters, goes on her most dangerous mission to rescue her little brother on the dark planet of Camazotz, Mrs. Witch gives her these words from 1 Corinthians. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. Now, Meg doesn't understand what these words mean at the time, but what she does come to understand eventually is that it is only love that can save her brother from the power of the evil of it, who holds her brother captive. As she stands before it, this pulsing brain on a dais who has her brother brainwashed, it makes sense in the book, don't worry, she realizes that not hate, not anger, not strength or intelligence, only love can save her brother. And so she stands there in the face of evil, loving her brother into freedom. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Those words are from Martin Luther King Jr. It is foolishness for God to be conquered, for God to become a vulnerable baby, for God to die on a cross. And yet, that foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. That which we perceive as weakness is stronger than human strength. And we can't quite understand it. And yet maybe we get it in glimpses, sometimes. So wisdom through foolishness and weakness. We've arrived at Act 4. Act 4, holy anger and wisdom as justice. John 2 recounts this high drama moment of Jesus losing his temper in the temple, letting his big feelings run wild. This temple cleansing narrative is found in all 4 gospel accounts, so it's pretty special. Interestingly, John puts the temple cleansing story right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, right after he's turned the water into wine at the wedding at Cana. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke put it at the end of the Jesus narrative as a preparation for going into Holy Week. So why does John put it at the beginning, and what does this have to do with wisdom? Foolishness, maybe. Who walks into a temple and starts upsetting the tables? This is a Jesus we conflict-avoidant pacifists may feel a little nervous around. This is an angry, whip-yielding, making a big old mess, Jesus. What is the point? Riding a donkey, sure. Healing the sick, fine. But destroying property? No. Drew Hart calls this strategic prophetic disruption. He explains that temple leadership and high priestly families benefited from the temple tax, from their collaboration with Rome, from the sacrifices of the Jews who traveled from all over to worship God. Jesus holds up a mirror to the rulers and authorities, to those benefiting from the exploitation of poor Jewish masses. The Jewish authorities are understandably upset with Jesus' unruly behavior. They were benefiting from the status quo. It was working well for them. People had to come from all over the land to make these sacrifices, and they couldn't bring their own animals because they were not without spot or blemish, so they had to buy these animals. They had to change their Roman coin into the temple coin. Hart goes on, the problem is not merely that there was buying and selling in God's house. It was that the flow of currency in the temple was going against its vocation and purpose. The temple was supposed to be a place of shalom and prayer and worship to God. It was supposed to form the people of God to be a people of justice, not a place for some to make money at the expense of others. In the Mark account of this story, Jesus says, "They have made my Father's house a den of robbers." Interestingly, a den of robbers refers to the place that robbers go after they have robbed someone with their loot, the place where they go to be safe. Jesus is saying that the wealthy Jewish money changers are acting as though the temple is their safe place, the place where even as they take advantage of people, they receive protection. Jesus is right to be angry. As we read this text in our current context, it is impossible not to hear the echoes of the reaction to the protests this past summer, as businesses were destroyed during the riots following the murder of George Floyd. They were attention-getting. They were symbolic. They spoke of the need to tear down systems that were unjust. And they were met with people who called for moderation. Protesting is one thing, but destroying property, no, we must have order. Property must be protected. And while this summer felt unique and like a moment of racial reckoning, we've been here before. In 2014, there was rioting in Ferguson after the grand jury cleared Officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of teenager Michael Brown. In 2015, riots in Baltimore followed the murder of Freddie Gray. In each of these instances, rioters were met with calls for moderation, for order. See if you recognize these words. It is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without at the same time condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention. And I must say tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice and humanity. These words are from Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. His words sound like they could have been said this year and not 50 years ago. Protests are rarely about one thing. While one incident might ignite a spark, generally they are a way for people without access to dominant power structures to show up with their bodies, with their pain, with their anger, with their hurt, and say, this is not right. And anger can be a source of wisdom about injustice. It can compel us to stand up and speak out and march with the unheard, not just to address individual wrongs, but to change systems. Me, Kim Court, writes that Jesus' actions in the temple are about more than changing temple practices. In John's gospel, Jesus isn't talking about changing the policies around who sells what and when. This isn't about reforming temple practices. He wants to turn over tables, yes, but also to turn over the very pillars of existence through his very existence. End quote. Jesus was angry, and that anger propelled him to action. He saw a system that was supposed to form people into justice-seeking people of God being twisted to benefit a few at the top. Jesus' actions said, pay attention. Something else is happening here. Look beyond the pigeons, beyond the money changers. I am doing something new. I'm trying to make myself known to you, to remind you again of who I am and who I care for. If you want to know Jesus and follow Jesus, you also need to get angry about injustice. And if you aren't angry, you're likely a pigeon seller, benefiting from the status quo. If we see only the damage to the tables and not the injustice of the system, we are complicit. And it may be time for the comfortable temples we have constructed to be torn down. The beauty of the sky, the promise of the relationship through the giving of the law, the willingness of God to be foolish for us, and the gift of anger that signals injustice. All of these are images of the way God is working in the world to be known and experienced, creating a world where there was nothing, rescuing and redeeming the Israelites, promising and limiting and expanding and teaching and showing and loving and proclaiming. God is never just one thing, and there is no one way for us to understand who God is. Because God is too much for us to comprehend. We start to become wise when we remember to catch glimpses. So pay attention to sunrises. Pay attention to righteous anger and tables on the ground. Pay attention to the things that seem foolish and weak. May we learn to know and experience God more fully in all the wise and wonderful ways God is revealing himself to us. May it be so. Amen.